tonight. As snow gently falls outside, let me tell you a story not often whispered in the warmth of hearths or the chatter of taverns. It's a story that lies at the edges of towns, behind stone walls and iron gates, in the quiet shuffling of a man with a hood and an axe. We begin not with a nobleman or a knight, but with a butcher's son. His name was Wilhelm, and his world was the stench of sawdust and meat, where cleavers sang louder than church bells, and where death wasn't feared, only priced. Wilhelm didn't choose to become an executioner. No child does, but fate has. A way of pressing sharp things into your hands when you least expect it. It started with a debt, not his, but his father's. A loan taken to save the family shop after a summer of sick livestock. The moneylender, a cold-eyed man named Adler, was patient, until he wasn't. When the time came to collect, Wilhelm's father had only meat and excuses, and so, the city. Magistrate intervened. Wilhelm watched from a cracked wooden bench as his father was sentenced. Not to death, but to servitude. 3 years breaking rocks outside the city gate, but the debt was still unpaid. "You're strong," Adler told Wilhelm, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "And the city is short one executioner." That's how it often happened. Executioners were rarely volunteers. They were coerced, inherited, or condemned to the role. No man of honor sought it, but once the role clung to you, it never let go. The first thing they did was shave Wilhelm's head, not just for hygiene, but to mark him. He was given a set of clothes no one else wanted, a coarse black tunic and thick leather boots stained from the last man who wore them. They called it a uniform, but really it was a warning. His first task was not an execution, but observation. He was made to watch, to stand still at the edge of the courtyard as a man knelt before the block, muttering prayers to a god who rarely answered in time. The axe came down with a sickening thud, not once, but 3 times. The old executioner, a man called Franz, handed Wilhelm a bucket. "You clean," he said gruffly, "and remember, if you need 3 swings, you're not ready." Wilhelm cleaned. He gagged. He cleaned again. The training wasn't what you'd expect. There was no school, no books, no scrolls of ancient wisdom. Just practice. Wilhelm was given animal carcasses, then mannequins made of straw wrapped in leather. He was told to aim between the 3rd and 4th vertebrae. "Like slicing through butter," Franz said, though it never felt that way. But the real weight wasn't in the blade. It was in the eyes. The way people looked at him changed. The baker stopped greeting him. The cobbler refused to mend his boots. Children whispered and ran the other way. Even his mother wouldn't touch the coin he brought home. She wrapped it in cloth and hid it beneath a floorboard. "Money from the dead carries death with it," she whispered. And yet, Wilhelm stayed. He grew stronger. His arms grew thick, his swing precise. But inside, something else hardened. It wasn't cruelty. It was numbness. Then came his first execution, a thief, convicted of stealing a priest's relic. It was a petty crime, but the relic was deemed sacred, and the punishment was death by axe. Wilhelm was told the man was ready. He was told the town was watching. He was told to make it clean. As he walked to the square, he could feel the crowd, not cheering, not jeering, just watching, hungry, curious, silent. The man knelt. Wilhelm hesitated. Franz stepped close, whispering, "If you flinch, they'll call you weak. If you miss, they'll call you a butcher. If you cry, they'll call you human. And they don't want a human. They want a tool." Wilhelm closed his eyes, then opened them. He swung, one clean cut. The crowd gasped. Then, as if rehearsed, they dispersed. No one clapped. No one thanked him. But he was given a loaf of bread and a pouch of coin. Payment, like any other job. That night, Wilhelm couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt, but because of how easily it had all happened. How quiet it was when the blade met the neck. How light the axe had felt in his hands. Over time, Wilhelm became the name whispered before trials, the man behind the cloth hood. Some feared him, some pitied him, but most ignored him. And that, dear listener, is where we begin. For to understand what it was truly like to be a medieval executioner, we must first understand the loneliness, the silence, the weight of a blade that never rusts, only waits. So tonight, as the snow gathers on your window, remember Wilhelm. Not the man who took lives, but the boy who never asked to, and ask yourself, if duty called, could you have held the axe? Tonight, as the wind hums through the trees and firelight flickers on your walls, I will tell you a tale that few would dare write down. A tale not of swords and kings, but of coin and consequence. Tonight we talk of blood money and the strange wages of the medieval executioner. After Wilhelm's first execution, he received two things: a loaf of dark rye bread and a pouch containing 8 silver pfennigs. He stared at them for a long time. Not because of their value, but because of the weight they carried. You see, in the medieval world, money was never just money. It carried memory. A silver coin might once have paid for a child's cradle, or bought a noose, and coins earned by killing a man were said to burn through the pocket unless properly cleansed. Executioners, though employed by cities or feudal lords, were often paid per head. That is to say, their income rose with the number of necks bowed before them. It was not a salary. It was a transaction. The condemned paid with blood. The executioner was paid in silver. The irony? Most cities detested their executioners, but also underpaid them. Some towns gave only a few coins per job, plus fringe benefits, if you can call them that. Wilhelm quickly learned what these were. For example, he was allowed to take the clothing of the executed, though they were often ragged or blood-stained beyond use. He could keep any personal possessions not claimed by family: rings, boots, sometimes even dentures carved from bone. He was given meat from butchered animals deemed unclean by the guild, including offal or diseased livestock. 2. The common man. This seemed like theft. But to the executioner, it was survival. Many towns refused to sell to him. Bakers turned their backs. Smiths refused to shoe his horse. Even the priest denied him confession. So he took what he could. Some towns tried to avoid paying entirely. One magistrate in Thuringia once told Wilhelm, "You should thank us. You get to serve justice." Wilhelm didn't respond. He simply handed the man a rusty blade and said, "Then you swing it." From that day, the magistrate paid on time, and yet the money never brought Wilhelm comfort. His mother refused to accept it. She hid it in a wooden jar sealed with wax and buried beneath the hearth. "Blood silver spoils the soul," she'd say, never touching it with bare hands. But Wilhelm needed that coin. He needed it to fix the roof when rain poured through the rafters. He needed it to buy new boots after frostbitten leather split. And when his mother took ill, he needed it to pay the apothecary, who doubled his price the moment he saw Wilhelm's face. Executioners weren't allowed to own land within city walls. They lived on the outskirts, in huts built too far for convenience but too close for comfort. Often they dug their own wells, mended their own roofs, and stitched their own clothes. But there was a darker side to blood money, the temptation to earn more. Some executioners, not Wilhelm, but others, began to suggest harsher punishments. In court, longer tortures, public executions. Why? Because each stage came with a fee. A hanging earned a small coin. A burning at the stake paid more, especially if the firewood came from your own cart. Torture before confession? That was a bonus. Breaking on the wheel? Double pay. If the prisoner lasted long. It turned death into a business, a twisted sort of theater where suffering meant profit. And while Wilhelm never took joy in these acts, he understood the system. If he refused, another would take his place, a worse man, perhaps. To make things stranger, some townspeople would tip the executioner to ensure a swift death for their loved one. Mothers slipped coins into his palm, whispering, "Make it clean." Husbands begged him to use a sharp blade. Some even tried to bribe him to spare a life, which he could not do. Justice had rules. Cold ones. Once, a woman offered Wilhelm her wedding ring in exchange for her brother's freedom. He refused. The man was hanged the next morning. That night, Wilhelm found the ring placed outside his door, wrapped in linen. He kept it, not for greed, but for memory. Despite the taboo, some people sought his help in other ways. A merchant once asked him to remove a rival quietly. Wilhelm declined. A nobleman asked him to teach his son how to use a sword. Wilhelm agreed and taught him how to sharpen it instead. A grieving father begged him to track down his daughters. Schiller. Wilhelm said nothing, but weeks later, a nameless corpse was found in the woods. Blood money in those days didn't always come from the city. Sometimes it arrived in envelopes. Sometimes it came with no note, just a coin and a name, and... So Wilhelm lived between two ledgers, one public, one hidden, both paid in silver. Both left scars. But not all wages were coin. There were towns, rare ones, that granted small privileges to executioners as if to apologize for their exile. One gave Wilhelm a plot of land behind the old mill. Another gave him free bread each Thursday. A third, most surprising of all, gave him a seat at council meetings, though no one spoke to him while he was there. None of it erased the looks, the whispers, the way candles dimmed when he entered a room. But it gave him purpose. In time, Wilhelm stopped counting the coins. He counted swings. He counted steps from cell to block. He counted breaths between judgment and silence. And when he slept, if he slept, he dreamed not of silver, but of eyes. Always eyes, watching, pleading, cursing, forgiving. So now, dear listener, as you rest beneath your warm blanket and close your eyes, think on this. We all labor for coin, but some must carry the cost in silence, and some coins never stop whispering. Tonight, as the night grows quieter and your room warms with soft candlelight, let us speak not of kings or castles, but of tools, old, crude, and deadly. Let us speak of the implements of justice, or punishment, or vengeance, depending on who held the power. These were not weapons of glory or honor. These were tools of ending. And for Wilhelm, the executioner, they were as familiar as a monk's rosary or a blacksmith's hammer. The axe was the first, and the most iconic. It wasn't the double-headed, polished blade you see in paintings or plays. Wilhelm's axe was heavy, single-edged, and brutally practical. Forged not for beauty but for precision, the edge had to be sharpened after every use. Not out of respect for the condemned, but to avoid a messy death. A dull axe turned justice into torment. Wilhelm learned early that the weight of the axe mattered more than its size. Too light, and the force would fail. Too heavy, and control was lost. His own axe weighed nearly 13 pounds, with a curved hickory handle and a blade etched only with a single notch for every 100 executions. Not as a trophy, but as record-keeping. He oiled it with animal fat and kept it in a chest beneath. His bed, away from light, away from memory, but the axe was only used for the honorable deaths. Beheadings granted to nobles, knights, or those who had somehow earned a cleaner end. For most, there was the rope. Ah, the rope. It seemed so simple, a length of hemp twisted tight and tied with a noose. But Wilhelm knew better. A proper hanging took calculation. Too short a drop, and the condemned would strangle slowly, clawing at their throat for minutes. Too long a drop, and the neck would snap so violently it could tear the head clean off. He had once witnessed that. A thief, small in stature, misjudged by the court clerk. The man fell and did not swing. The crowd gasped. Wilhelm said nothing. But after that, he began measuring every prisoner himself. The noose was tied with a hangman's knot. 13 coils, not out of superstition, but balance. He learned to tilt the head just right so the knot would slide behind the ear, breaking the neck on impact. A mercy, if such a word could be used. And yet, the rope had its burdens. It was reused. Boiled after each execution, scrubbed with vinegar, dried in the sun. But stains never fully vanished. Wilhelm could always smell the sweat, the fear, and the blood where the neck tore. He stored it coiled in a clay jar, sealed with wax and marked with red paint, not to frighten, but to warn. Then came the fire, burning at the stake, the most spectacular and terrifying form of death. It was rarely used for murderers or thieves. No, fire was reserved for heretics, witches, and traitors. Crimes not just against people, but against God and the crown. And thus, the punishment had to be divine, or at least look that way. Wilhelm hated it. Building the pyre was an art. Logs. First, then kindling, then bundles of straw soaked in oil. The condemned was tied to the stake, hands behind, chest exposed, legs bound. Sometimes the city allowed for a small pouch of gunpowder tied at the neck, a gift of mercy that exploded and killed instantly when the flames reached it. But more often, the condemned screamed and screamed. The crowd watched not in reverence, but in awe. Fire drew people. It danced. It consumed. It purified. The church called it cleansing. Wilhelm called it cruelty. He once tried to stand behind the flames so he wouldn't see their faces, but the smoke clung to him. It followed him home. It woke him at night. In dreams, he saw not fire, but eyes burning within it. There were other tools, too, lesser known, instruments of torture meant not for death, but confession. The rack, ropes wound around limbs, pulled tighter until bones dislocated, ligaments tore, and screams filled stone chambers. The iron boot, heated and placed over the foot until flesh sizzled. Thumbscrews, the pair of anguish, the Iron Maiden, all real, all horrifying. Wilhelm used them rarely, only when ordered, and always with gloves. He never spoke during torture. Words made it worse. Silence was a mercy. But the worst tool of all? The block. It sat in the square, unmoving and unnoticed until needed. Just a slab of oak, stained black with age and soaked deep with history. Wilhelm wiped it after each use, not for hygiene, but ritual. He knew that the block absorbed more than blood. It absorbed memory. It smelled of sorrow, of endings, of the final breath between life and silence. Sometimes when Wilhelm touched it, it felt warm. Tools like these were not feared because of what they did. They were feared because of what they represented. They were symbols. They told the crowd, "This is the price of disobedience. This is the shape of justice." But for Wilhelm, they were simply that, tools. He sharpened. He cleaned. He stored them in their places, just as a farmer tended his plow or a baker his oven. And yet every time he reached for one, a part of him paused. Not because he feared the task, but because he remembered the weight that never left his hands. Long after the work was done. So tonight, dear listener, as the world outside grows still and your eyelids grow heavy, Think not only of swords and glory, but of simpler, crueler tools, the axe, the rope, and the fire. And think of the man who held them, not as a villain, not as a hero, just as a man. Tonight, as your tea grows cold and your eyes begin to dim, I want to speak of silence, not the comforting kind found in snowfall or candlelight, but the cold, hollow silence that follows a man long after his work is done. The silence of the executioner's table, where no one dares to sit. You see, Wilhelm, though hired by the city and paid by its courts, was not one of its people. He was neither criminal nor noble, neither beggar nor tradesman. He existed in a strange in-between, feared, needed, but never welcomed. After an execution, the square would empty quickly. The crowd scattered. Vendors packed their carts. Judges returned to their scrolls. Wilhelm, blood on his boots, would walk alone back to the edge of town. And when he passed through the market, even on quiet days, it was as though he carried the plague. The butcher turned his back. The seamstress dropped her needle. Children were yanked indoors. No one spat at him. No one cursed. That would be too bold. They simply disappeared. In medieval towns, executioners were subject to a form of civic exile, not formally declared, not written in law, but practiced every day with remarkable consistency. Some of it was superstition. Some of it was social ritual. But most of it was fear. Many believed that a man who killed, even by law, was cursed, that his presence might bring bad harvests, illness, or madness, that his touch could taint food, his shadow could sour milk, so he was kept separate. He ate alone, often not by choice, but because no one would share a bench. There were stories, always whispered, of executioners who tried to court a local girl. One such tale spoke of a young man from Lübeck who fell in love with a baker's daughter. She loved him back, until her father found out. That night, the executioner's house was burned down. He survived. Their love did not. Wilhelm learned quickly. He built his cottage just beyond the city boundary, near a bend in the river. The land was poor, but he tended a small garden. He raised chickens. He learned to mend his own clothes, tan his own leather, and even patch his own roof. Not out of pride, but because no one would do it for him. Once during a particularly harsh winter, his chimney cracked. The mason agreed to come, for triple the price. When Wilhelm handed him the coin, the mason took it with tongs. Even priests were hesitant. Confession was supposed to be open to all, yet Wilhelm was often the last to enter the chapel, if allowed at all. He sat in the back pew, never at the altar. He left before the final hymn. Communion, rarely offered. Marriage, only to widows, or to the daughters of other outcasts, grave diggers, night soil men, or occasionally fellow executioners. There was a strange network of them scattered across cities and provinces. Men like Wilhelm, living at the edges of maps. They didn't write letters. They didn't share tales. But when they crossed paths, there was always a nod, a silent brotherhood. Once a year, on the feast of St. Bartholomew, a few of them would gather outside of Erfurt. No one spoke much. They drank bitter beer, shared bread, and sharpened blades by the firelight. Not for ritual, for maintenance. And then they returned to their corners of the world. Even the dead treated Wilhelm differently. Families of the executed rarely claimed the bodies. Superstition again. They feared the soul might linger, or worse, follow them home. So Wilhelm buried them. He carved no names, planted no flowers, but he remembered every face. And when the town held festivals, midsummer dances, harvest feasts, or saints' days, he was never invited. If he came, eyes followed him like knives. So he stayed home, watching the lanterns from afar, the laughter fading before it reached his door. But isolation did not mean ignorance. Wilhelm knew every rumor, every secret, every lie the magistrate told behind closed doors. People assumed he was deaf, blind, dumb. But an executioner sees everything and remembers. He knew which merchant watered his wine. He knew which priest took coin for forgiveness. He knew who beat their servant and blamed the bruises on stairs. And because no one spoke to him, no one realized how much he heard. Still, there were rare moments, flickers of humanity. Once a young girl wandered to his gate. She had lost her cat. Wilhelm helped her find it, climbing into a thicket with thorns that tore his arms. The next morning, he found a fresh-baked roll on his doorstep. No note, just warmth. Another time, an old woman slipped him a clove of garlic at market. "For your chickens," she said, though everyone knew garlic was for warding off evil. Still, he planted it. But kindness was fleeting. When Wilhelm walked into a tavern, the room fell quiet. When he sat, others stood. The innkeeper placed his drink at the far end of the bar. No one touched the mug after him. Even the dogs stayed away, and yet the townspeople slept soundly, because they knew, should something terrible happen, a murder, a betrayal, a witchcraft accusation, Wilhelm would be there. Steady, silent, efficient. He was the blade in their back pocket, the fire in their courtroom, the rope on their conscience. And when justice had been served, and the body taken away, and the crowd gone home to eat, Wilhelm sat alone, dinner after death. So tonight, as you lay your head upon the pillow and listen to the wind outside, remember this. There are those among us who carry society's weight in silence. They do not dine at your table, but they make sure your house stays safe. Tonight, as your blankets settle over you and the world outside exhales into stillness, I want to tell you not of death, but of distance. Not the kind measured in miles, but the kind measured in glances avoided, hands not held, chairs not offered. This is the chapter of loneliness, of the executioner's solitude, of Wilhelm. He had once been a boy who played in the mud, who dreamed of fishing and warm bread, who dared to smile at the mayor's daughter when she passed with a ribbon in her hair. But after he became the man with the axe, no one remembered the boy, or perhaps no one wanted to. The townsfolk did not whisper his name with cruelty. They barely whispered it at all, as if saying it might summon death. They called him the headsman, or simply him. In church sermons, the priest never looked at him, and at town meetings, no one addressed him directly. And so, Wilhelm spoke less. He found no joy in conversation that ended before it began. He once tried to strike up a greeting with the candlemaker, a man who had once shared bread with him as a child. But the candlemaker only blinked and said, "I've got no wax to spare." That was the end of it. Friendship, real, human, soul-bonding friendship, was as distant to Wilhelm as springtime is to a man buried in snow. He watched others form bonds. He saw neighbors helping each other patch roofs. He saw fathers lift children onto their shoulders at festivals. He saw young men walk arm in arm with sweethearts, laughing into the dusk. But when Wilhelm walked past, the laughter quieted. Eyes drifted away. Some crossed themselves. Others pretended not to see him at all. Even animals seemed to treat him with suspicion. Dogs growled when he approached. Horses pulled away when he neared their stalls. Cats slinked beneath doorways, and yet loneliness wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was subtle, lingering, a kind of hunger that crept beneath your skin and made your chest feel hollow in the quiet moments between tasks. At night, Wilhelm sat beside the fire with no one to speak to. The walls did not echo his voice. The chickens did not listen. The trees outside only rustled. He tried once to write a letter to a childhood friend who had moved to another village. But halfway through he realized he had nothing to say except, "I am still here." And so he burned the parchment. There was no one to share stories with, no one to joke with, no one to ask, "Do you remember when?" Because no one ever remembered with him, only about him. And when it came to love, well, Wilhelm had eyes, of course. He noticed beauty. He noticed laughter, grace, the way some women carried baskets with a sway that made the air sweeter. But to approach them? To imagine a future? No. He knew better. He once saw a young washerwoman drop her scarf. Wilhelm picked it up and tried to return it. She stared at the scarf, then at him, and slowly backed away without a word. The next morning, the scarf lay folded. Outside his door, clean, pressed, tied with twine. No note. He didn't touch it. He burned it in the hearth. There were only 2 women in town who ever spoke to him willingly. One was old, toothless, and half-blind. She mistook him for her son, long since dead. The other was a widow who mended fishing nets. She never asked his name, but once offered him a cup of broth on a cold day. They sat in silence on opposite ends of the bench. She told him about her dead husband. He listened. When the broth was gone, he thanked her. They never spoke again. The church, too, had no place for Wilhelm. Though he attended Mass from the shadows, he was never offered the host. When a new priest arrived and tried to welcome him, the congregation objected, loudly. Wilhelm withdrew again to the back pew. He read scriptures in private, not for salvation, but for rhythm, for the peace of the words. Psalms whispered before sleep. Proverbs read by candlelight. But he could never confess. Not properly. Not with a priest who would look him in the eye. And so he became his own priest, his own confessor, his own absolution. He built a small shrine in the woods behind his cottage. Not grand, just stones stacked beneath an old oak, a wooden cross carved with his own hands. There he knelt, sometimes in the morning mist, sometimes under the stars, and whispered into the stillness. He never asked for forgiveness. He only asked to be remembered. One day, a traveling juggler passed through town and dared speak with Wilhelm. The man was drunk and bold and didn't know who he was. They shared ale and stories by the fire. Wilhelm laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years. The next morning, the juggler was gone. No note, no farewell, just vanished. The townsfolk said he had learned who Wilhelm was and fled. Wilhelm said nothing. Loneliness became a coat he wore every day. It protected him, made him less noticeable, less vulnerable. But on the coldest nights when wind crept through the window slats and the fire burned low, even coats can't keep out the chill of solitude. He sometimes imagined what it might feel like to hold someone's hand, to be asked how his day was, to be missed. But imagination, like hunger, makes the ache worse. So instead he carved wood, little figurines, birds, horses, saints. He lined them along the mantel, each one a conversation never had, a friend never made, and he told himself stories, not of executions, but of gardens and oceans, and a world where the man with the axe could one day lay it down. So now, dear listener, as your room softens into dreams and the wind rustles outside without malice, think of Wilhelm, not as a figure of fear, but as a man who gave up companionship so that others might feel justice, had a face, even if it was one no one wished to see. Sleep well, for even the loneliest souls once knew warmth, and sometimes, if we remember them kindly, they find it again. Tonight, as the world lies still beyond your window and the embers glow gently in your hearth, let us speak of the moments that haunt even the steadiest of hands. Let us speak of failure, quiet, irreversible failure, in the hands of the executioner, because even a sharp blade, sometimes falters. Wilhelm knew this truth long before he ever missed. Old Franz, the man who trained him, had once whispered over a pail of bloody water, "There's no shame like a second swing." Then he said no more and scrubbed the axe with vinegar and sand until his knuckles bled. The first time it happened to Wilhelm, he was 26. The condemned was a merchant named Lucas, well-fed, proud, convicted of cheating noble clients by weighing coins with tampered scales. The punishment was death by beheading, public for the sake of appearances. Wilhelm did everything right. He measured the neck, he sharpened the blade, he said the rites, but the man tensed at the last second. Jerked. The blade struck crooked, catching bone, but not enough. The scream that followed was inhuman. The crowd gasped. Some turned away. Others watched, not out of cruelty, but in frozen disbelief. Wilhelm stepped forward, jaw clenched, and delivered the second blow. Then a third. The body slumped. The square fell silent. But the silence wasn't reverent. It was heavy. Afterward, Wilhelm didn't eat for 2 days. He cleaned the axe, burned his gloves, and stared at his hands for hours. When he closed his eyes, he saw the twitching limbs, heard the rasp of air from a mouth still trying to speak. He would never forget the sound of a man halfway between life and death. The townsfolk were less forgiving. They whispered louder after. "That. Is he getting weak? Should we bring in someone else?" A man who needs 3 swings shouldn't be trusted with justice. They didn't care that Lucas had moved. They didn't know that Wilhelm had been ill with fever the night before. They only saw the mess. In those days, executioners were judged by cleanliness. A good death was a quiet one. 1 stroke, no blood spray, a neck that bent gently into the basket. Anything less was scandalous. And yet, mistakes were inevitable. Some bodies were difficult. Thick bones, old injuries, fear-stiffened muscles. Sometimes the condemned thrashed at the last second, clenching every tendon against the blade. Sometimes the axe simply struck wrong. Wilhelm began to double-check. Everything. He examined the block before every execution, measured the prisoner's height, rehearsed his stance in silence, feet firm, wrists locked. He changed the angle of approach, not out of vanity, but control. But even with all that, it happened again. A woman named Elska, accused of witchcraft. Frail, elderly, tied at the wrists with a rosary. The first strike shattered the spine, but didn't sever the neck. She didn't scream. She only whimpered. A sound so soft that even the wind seemed to hush for it. Wilhelm hesitated, just for a breath, and then finished it. Afterward, he stood alone in the square, the axe in his hands, dripping. The crowd had already turned away. A priest crossed himself, from afar. Wilhelm washed his hands in melted snow that night, long after the sun had fled, but they still smelled of iron. He began to fear the block more than the blade, because the block was witness. The block remembered. Each mistake soaked into its grain like wine into cloth. He spoke to it once, in a moment of madness. "I'm sorry," he said. The wind answered. Some towns tried to ease the burden. They began offering wine to the condemned. The cup of mercy, they called it. A strong red laced sometimes with herbs, enough to dull the senses, but not always. Some refused it. Others drank and still trembled. Wilhelm, too, drank. Never before an execution, but always after. There was no training for how to live with failure. No manual for the dreams that came. Dreams where the blade sank, and the eyes blinked, and the mouth moved but made no sound. Dreams where the block whispered names. He began carving the names into the inside of his tool chest, not to remember, but to confess. There were 17 notches by the time he turned 40. 17 times he had failed to grant a clean death. That was 17 ghosts. He began to see them sometimes, not truly, but in the corner of his vision, leaning in alleyways, reflected in puddles. He didn't flinch. He just nodded, as if to say, yes. I remember, because forgetting would be the greater sin. One winter, a young assistant was assigned to him, a boy named Jakob, barely 16. Eager, naive, Wilhelm. Tried to warn him. It's not the blood you'll fear, he said. It's the silence after. Jakob didn't understand. Not then. His first execution went well. His second did not. A nobleman's son, condemned for dueling without sanction, tall, proud, terrified. Jakob swung, missed. The blow tore through. The shoulder. The man screamed. Wilhelm stepped in, finished it. Jakob didn't speak for 2 days. Then he disappeared, left behind a note that read, I cannot be death and live among the living. Wilhelm understood. He buried the note beside the old oak near his shrine. He never took another apprentice. So now, dear listener, as your breathing slows and your room grows still, remember this. Even those who deal in death can be haunted, not by guilt alone, but by the echo of a swing that should have ended everything, and didn't. Sleep softly. Even the blade sometimes trembles. Tonight, as the moon hangs low and the wind brushes gently through unseen trees, I will tell you about a strange and unsettling truth. Not all deaths were met with silence. Some were met with cheers, because in the towns of old, when a man was sentenced to die, it was not only justice being served, it was entertainment, and Wilhelm, the executioner, was expected not only to deliver death, but to perform it. The square would fill early. Children were lifted onto shoulders. Vendors hawked roasted chestnuts and sour ale. Some sold pastries shaped like skulls. Others set up games for coin tosses and wooden dice. It wasn't a solemn affair. It was festive. It was expected. The bell would ring once, twice, then 3 times, and the crowd would hush just long enough for the condemned to appear, bound, dirty, broken. Some cried, some cursed, a few, the ones who had made peace with their fate, walked proudly, and behind them always came Wilhelm, cloaked in black, hood drawn, axe glinting in the morning light. To the crowd, he was not a man. He was the hand of the law, a figure from folk tales and whispered warnings. Children pointed, elders crossed themselves. Women whispered prayers, and then silence. For just a moment, the magistrate would read the sentence. The condemned would be asked for final words. The priest would mumble last rites, and Wilhelm would step forward. What came next was not always clean nor quick, but it was expected to look that way because the townspeople, they didn't just want justice. They wanted a show. They wanted to feel something: fear, relief, vengeance, power. They wanted to see a body fall, to hear a thud, to taste the closeness of death, and then walk away untouched by it. And when the axe struck true, when the swing was clean, the head fell neatly, and the body slumped without twitch, they cheered, not always loudly. Sometimes it was a murmur of approval, sometimes applause, sometimes just a nod, like patrons at a play. But sometimes, on the days when the crime had shaken the town, or when the accused had resisted arrest, or when gossip had turned the condemned into a villain, they roared. They roared like it was a victory, as if they'd slain the evil themselves. Wilhelm never looked up when they clapped. He wiped the blade, collected his tools, walked away. But in his chest, something cold curled tighter, because death was not a spectacle to him. It was weight. It was residue. It was something you carried home in silence. And yet the crowd wanted more. Over time, Wilhelm noticed the way the townsfolk leaned in when the condemned wept. He noticed the laughter when a drunkard stumbled on his way to the block. He noticed how parents warned their children, "Mind your manners or the headsman will come for you." He became a symbol, not a man, a part of the city's rhythm. The butcher sold more meat after a hanging. The tavern filled faster on days when the stake was lit. Execution days were market days too. Wilhelm hated it, but he couldn't stop it. One day, a young boy approached. Him after an execution, maybe 10 years old, mud on his boots and wide eyes filled with fascination. "Is it heavy?" he asked, pointing to the axe. Wilhelm nodded. The boy grinned. "I want to be like you someday." That night, Wilhelm sharpened his axe in silence and wept into the grindstone. Not because the blade was dull, but because the boy didn't understand what it meant to never be held again. To be feared by all. To be a man whom no one cheered for, even when he did his job perfectly. There were exceptions, of course. Times when the crowd did not cheer, when the condemned was loved, or wrongly accused, or young. Once, a girl of 15, sentenced for theft, stood on the block. She didn't cry, but her mother did, loudly, desperately. The crowd turned quiet. No vendors sold treats that day, and when the axe fell, the silence afterward was unbearable. Wilhelm went home and didn't speak for days. Still, the city demanded spectacle. When burnings were announced, crowds tripled. The fire crackled, the smoke danced, and the townspeople watched with morbid awe. It wasn't just about punishment. It was about presence, being there, telling the story later. "I saw it. I was there," she screamed. Wilhelm began to think the worst part wasn't the execution itself. It was the crowd, their hunger, their delight, their forgetfulness. They went home to supper. He went home to silence. And yet he could not stop them. He once asked the priest, "Why do they cheer?" The priest said, "Because it's not them. Simple, cold, true." And so Wilhelm continued. He stepped into the square. He listened to the clapping. He endured the eyes. He swung the axe. And when the cheer rose up like thunder, he disappeared into the shadows before it could touch him. Because applause meant nothing when your hands smelled of blood. So now, dear listener, as you drift toward sleep, know this. Not all cheers are kind. Not all crowds are just. And not all spectacles should be watched. Some should be remembered, quietly, with sorrow and with respect for the one who bore the burden, so others could forget it, tonight. As the stars shimmer like distant memories, and your breath slows beneath the weight of sleep, I want to tell you not about punishment, nor guilt, nor the instruments of death. I want to tell you about mercy, soft, aching mercy, and what it costs to offer it when you wear the hood of the executioner. It was late autumn when she came to Wilhelm. The leaves had already turned. The earth smelled of ash and rot. Smoke curled from distant chimneys, and the wind sang low through bare branches. She arrived at dusk, her cloak frayed, her eyes dark with grief. Her name was Magda, and she was the wife, no, the widow, of a man sentenced to die at sunrise. Wilhelm had just returned from sharpening the axe. The blade was wrapped in cloth and set beside his hearth. He had not yet boiled the water for his evening broth when the knock came. Not many knocked at his door. When he opened it, she did not flinch. She looked him in the eyes. "My husband is." "Karl," she said. Wilhelm nodded. He knew the name, a tanner's apprentice, accused of striking a nobleman in a tavern quarrel. The nobleman's wound was minor, but his pride wasn't. The sentence had come swiftly. Beheading, public. "My husband is not a killer," she said, voice steady. "But I know I cannot save him." Wilhelm said nothing. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small linen pouch. "I do not ask you to free him," she said. I know you cannot, but I ask for mercy." Wilhelm blinked. She opened the pouch. Inside was a small vial, a dark, bitter tincture, enough to slow a heartbeat, to dull the senses, to blur the mind before the blade. "Let him die without fear," she said. "Let him sleep." Wilhelm stared at the pouch. Executioners were not permitted to administer anything to the condemned outside official rites. The church forbade it. The court forbade it. Even the executioner's own oath, spoken in secret, sworn before he first touched the axe, forbade it. But there, in the dim firelight, stood a woman who had already buried her future. And she was offering him no coin, no bribe, only love. He stepped back and let her in. They sat across from each other in silence. The fire crackled. A single candle guttered in the breeze. She did not weep. She simply told him stories. How Carl had saved a bird with a broken wing. How he carved little toys from scrap leather for her nephew. How he once gave away his winter boots to a beggar and limped home barefoot through the snow. And when she finished, she placed the pouch on the table and stood. She did not ask for a promise. She did not wait for an answer. She left without another word. Wilhelm stared at the pouch until the candle went out. That night, he did not sleep. At dawn, the square filled, as it always did. The drums sounded. The magistrate read the charge. Carl stood calm, pale, but upright. He looked to the sky more than to the crowd. He spoke no last words. Wilhelm approached. Their eyes met. Just once, no recognition, no fear, only resignation. He knelt. Wilhelm reached into his cloak and withdrew. Nothing. He left the vial at home, because he could not risk it. Not for the man, not for the widow, not even for himself. If discovered, the penalty was death, and worse, discredit. The weight of the executioner's office would be stripped from him, and the town would remember not his mercy, but his disobedience. So he placed a steady hand on Carl's shoulder, and he whispered so softly only the birds above could hear, "I will make it swift." The axe fell once. Clean. The crowd murmured. Wilhelm walked away. That night he returned to his cottage and found something at his door. A bundle of rosemary, tied with thread, freshly cut. No note, no name, just the scent of remembrance. He boiled the rosemary into tea, drank it slowly, and slept, not soundly, but without dreams. In the weeks that followed, he thought often of the widow, of what it meant to be merciful within the walls of duty, of how mercy was not always action. Sometimes it was restraint, a held word, a promise unspoken but kept. He thought of how easily the court delivered judgment and how difficult it was to carry that judgment with kindness. He wondered if Magda hated him. He hoped she did not. And when the next execution came, he sharpened the axe more carefully than ever before. He whispered the same promise. He held the same silence. Because he could not change the law, but he could still control how a man left the world. And that, perhaps, was a kind of mercy. So now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath grows slow, remember this. Sometimes mercy is not grand. Sometimes it is small, quiet, hidden in the flicker of a flame, or the scent of rosemary on a cold stone doorstep. Tonight, as candlelight dances gently across your walls and your breath grows deep and even, let me tell you of the quiet transactions that never appear in ledgers, of silver passed between shadows, of whispered names, of a man who knew too much and could never speak. This is the story of Wilhelm's silence. You see, an executioner was not only a blade, he was a witness to confessions, to fear, to the final truths of desperate men. And in a world where justice wore many faces, those truths, had value. It began with a magistrate, a rotund man named Richter, fond of sweet wine and sour bargains. One evening, Richter summoned Wilhelm not to the court, but to a private room in the back of the church. The air smelled of wax and damp stone. "Tomorrow's. Condemned," Richter said. "Has friends in high places." Wilhelm said nothing. "He's confessed," the magistrate continued. "But if that confession were to vanish, his family would be grateful." He slid a pouch of silver across the table. Very grateful. Wilhelm looked at the pouch, then back at Richter, and said only, "I do not keep records." It wasn't a lie. Wilhelm never wrote down names. He carved some into the underside of his axe handle, but never for anyone else's eyes. Still, the message was clear. He would not lie. He would not erase. The magistrate frowned. "You'll make enemies," he warned. Wilhelm only nodded. He had no friends to lose anyway. But that was just the beginning. Over the years, others came. A merchant, trembling, who begged him to falsify a confession, to frame a rival, already imprisoned, for a fire he hadn't set. Wilhelm refused. 2 nights later, his chicken coop was burned to the ground. He rebuilt it in silence. A noblewoman, veiled and scented with perfume strong enough to mask fear, came under cover of night. Her brother stood, accused of theft. She offered Wilhelm a necklace, pearls and jet. "I know you cannot release him," she said, "but perhaps you might delay his turn." Wilhelm considered it. Delay meant another name might be called first, another neck bowed, another life taken in place of her brother's. He returned the necklace. "The schedule is not mine." He lied, but it was. And still, he kept it. Because justice, even when flawed, was still better than being the one who decided who went first. Sometimes it wasn't bribes. Sometimes it was secrets. A condemned man once whispered, "I know where the bishop hides his gold." Another claimed to have seen the mayor's son in the brothel's cellar with someone who wasn't his wife. A third named 3 town guards who had extorted him for years and swore vengeance if he lived. Wilhelm listened and then ended their sentences. He never repeated what he heard, not out of loyalty, not out of law, but because secrets like blood stain the hands, and he had enough of both. But the silence had a price. Each secret became a stone tucked into the folds of his memory, heavy, still, unspoken. Once a dying thief told Wilhelm where a body was buried, a girl missing for months. Wilhelm considered telling the girl's mother. He even walked to her cottage. But when he saw her mending a blanket, humming softly, eyes ringed with grief but not madness, he turned away. What good would truth bring now? Only more pain. So he buried that secret too. In the woods behind his home, beneath the old oak, he dug a small hole. Not for a body, but for a stone. He carved an initial into it, just one, then covered it with earth, a ritual. He would repeat it many times. There were rumors, of course, that Wilhelm accepted bribes, that he kept a list of names, that he held court in his cottage, offering mercy for coin and judgment for silence. None were true, and yet they weren't fully false either. Because every man who carries power also carries the temptation to use it, and Wilhelm, despite all his resolve, was still human. He once accepted bread from a widow who offered nothing else. He once gave a condemned man a longer walk to the square just so he could feel the sun one last time. Tiny mercies, unpaid, but remembered. Still, others demanded more. And when Wilhelm refused, he paid for it. His windows were shattered. His well was poisoned. His name was carved into the side of the tavern's outhouse, followed by a crude sketch and a curse. He cleaned it himself, but never spoke of it, because silence was his trade now, not just in death, but in life. He once confided in a traveling friar, a man too old to fear, too kind to judge. "I hold more secrets than the court," Wilhelm said. The friar nodded. "And yet you are the only one who cannot confess." That stayed with him, and so Wilhelm built a box, small, wooden, with a lock only he held the key for. Inside, he placed objects: a ribbon from a girl falsely accused, a coin from a merchant who lied and was believed, a letter he never opened, left on his doorstep after an execution. These were not trophies. They were reminders of the weight of silence, of the cost of doing nothing, of the cost of doing anything. So now, dear listener, as your breath deepens and the fire sinks low, think of Wilhelm, the man who held the axe, and the truths no one else dared carry. Think of the silence he bore, not as emptiness, but as protection for the guilty, for the innocent, and for the man caught in between. Tonight, as the bells of midnight fade into silence and your soul eases into sleep, let us speak of faith. Not the kind etched in stained glass or sung in hymns, but the quiet, questioning kind that lives in the heart of a man who lives in the name of law. This is the chapter of Wilhelm and the Church. He had always believed, or at least he thought he had. As a boy, Wilhelm knelt in the back pew beside his mother. He lit candles. He learned the prayers. He whispered Latin syllables before he understood what they meant. He watched saints carved into stone archways and wondered if they ever blinked when no one looked. But when he became the executioner, something changed. It wasn't that his faith vanished, it was that it became inconvenient. The Church did not forbid execution. In fact, it sanctioned it. It justified it with verses and doctrine. Justice is the sword of God, the priests would say. To spare the guilty is to betray the innocent. And yet, they kept Wilhelm at a distance. He was welcome in the chapel, yes, but not in the sanctuary. He could sit, but not kneel near the altar. He could listen, but was never invited to speak. On feast days, he stood behind the choir screen, hidden behind wooden filigree. When it came time for communion, the priest would glance past him. Once, he stepped forward anyway. The chalice was withheld. "You bear the stain of death," the deacon murmured, "and until you are absolved." But no priest would hear his confession, because who, after all, can absolve the man who has ended hundreds? There were whispers that Wilhelm was unclean, spiritually marked, that every soul he sent beyond the veil weighed against his own, that even when acting in service of the law, he was tainted by the blade. And yet, they still used him. The Church gave him names, condemned heretics, blasphemers, witches. They ordered the pyres built high, the flames bright. They wrote the sermons to be shouted before the match was struck. And then, when it was done, they turned their backs again. Wilhelm began to build his own faith, quietly, in pieces. He read scripture not for doctrine, but for comfort. He whispered psalms while sharpening his axe, not out of ritual, but rhythm. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness." He repeated that one most often. He carved a small wooden cross with his own hands and hung it over his hearth. It had no gold, no jewels, just knots in the grain and calluses in the carving. Sometimes, after an execution, he would stand before it for hours, unmoving. Once, after burning a woman accused of sorcery, her only crime having been speaking in a dialect no one understood, he came home, stripped off his cloak, and knelt. And he asked, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. None came. The next day, he went back to work. He tried to speak with one priest, a traveling friar from the south. The man seemed kinder than most. He listened. He offered bread. He did not flinch. "Am I damned?" Wilhelm asked him once. The friar did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, "If your heart remains soft enough to ask, perhaps not." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him in years. But the friar left the next morning. Wilhelm never saw him again. There were moments when his faith fractured. One particularly bitter winter, a child was sentenced for stealing bread. Just 10 years old. The court showed mercy. No execution, just a branding on the hand. Wilhelm was ordered to perform it. He refused. The church intervened. "A mark is better than death," the priest said. "No child should carry either," Wilhelm replied. They threatened to replace him. He sharpened his axe anyway. In the end, the child was pardoned. The bread had been moldy. The shopkeeper had lied. But Wilhelm never forgot how quickly the church had bent toward punishment. From that day, his prayers changed. He stopped asking for mercy. He asked for clarity, to know when to speak, to know when to hold the blade, to know if he was becoming less man and more shadow. He built a shrine in the woods behind his cottage, not to saints, but to memory. Stones stacked in silence, one for each time he had questioned the orders given, one for each time he'd obeyed. Anyway, he never asked the church to bless it. It was his alone, and yet he still believed. Not in men, not in rituals, but in something. The way dawn breaks, no matter how dark the night. The way a kind word can echo longer than cruelty. The way even condemned men sometimes looked at the sky before they died. Not with fear, but hope. He believed in that. So now, dear listener, as your breath slows and the world fades into peace, think of Wilhelm, the man who stood at the edge of death and still looked for light. Not in cathedrals, not in absolution, but in the silence between prayers, and in the steady hands that still dared to ask if they were clean. Tonight, as the air cools and your thoughts drift toward sleep, let me tell you a story of return, not of heroes or kings, but of a shadow once cast and never forgotten. It is a story of memory, of guilt, and of an apprentice who came back long after his lesson had ended. Wilhelm never expected to see Jakob again. The boy had been bright-eyed and strong-armed, eager to learn, too eager to please. He had arrived one summer day with a note from the magistrate and a bundle slung over his shoulder. "Assigned to assist," the note had read. Barely 16. Wilhelm didn't want him, but he accepted him. He taught Jakob the rituals. How to measure the condemned. How to sharpen the axe with slow, even strokes. How to clean the blade in silence and burn the cloth afterward. He warned him, "This is not a trade. It is a burden." Jakob listened until the day he failed. It was a young noble sentenced for an unsanctioned duel. Tall, proud, shaking. Jakob swung. The cut went sideways. The noble screamed. Wilhelm stepped in, finished it, and looked at the boy. Jakob's hands were shaking. He left that night without a word. No one heard from him again, until years later, 12 winters to be exact, when a hooded figure arrived at Wilhelm's door just past dusk. The chickens stirred. The wind fell still. Wilhelm opened the door and saw eyes he hadn't forgotten. Older, sharper, haunted. "Jakob," Wilhelm said. The man didn't smile. "I have returned," he replied. They stood in silence. The hearth behind Wilhelm crackled softly. Finally, Wilhelm stepped aside. Jakob entered. He didn't sit. "I thought I could leave it behind," he said. "I thought I could forget." Wilhelm said nothing. "I became a smith," Jakob continued. "Far from here, married, had a child." Wilhelm nodded once. "She died." Wilhelm's breath caught. "The child," Jakob added, as if the weight of those two words needed no decoration. fever, then the mother, then I came back. Wilhelm didn't ask why. He knew, because death, once held, never truly leaves. Your hands. I see them when I sleep, Jacob said, even the ones I didn't kill. He sat now, finally across from the hearth, his hands open, calloused, trembling. I thought if I came back, if I looked you in the eye, maybe I could leave it behind. Wilhelm stared at the flames. There is no behind, he said softly. Only beside. Jacob frowned. Beside? Wilhelm reached into the chest beside him and pulled out his axe. Still wrapped in cloth, still oiled and sharp. You do not forget. You do not move on. You carry it, beside you, like a shadow. Jacob looked away. Wilhelm studied the younger man's face, then asked, Do you want to take it up again? Jacob's head snapped toward him. No, he said too quickly. Then softer, yes. Wilhelm stood, walked to the mantel, took down the wooden cross he'd carved years ago. He placed it in Jacob's hands. Then start here, he said. Not with the axe, with the weight. Jacob clutched it tightly. They spoke little that night. Jacob slept by the fire, and in the morning Wilhelm was already gone, summoned to a hanging outside the town gate. He left a note on the table. Come if you choose, but not to watch, to witness. Jacob came. He didn't stand close. He stood just far enough that the wind couldn't carry the sound, but he watched. When Wilhelm returned, Jacob was still in the cottage, brewing tea. He offered a cup. Wilhelm took it. Jacob didn't leave that night or the next. He stayed a week, then a month. He didn't ask to be the apprentice again. He just remained. He fed the chickens, tended the garden, carved wooden toys for children who never came. And on certain mornings, he stood beside Wilhelm as they prepared for judgment. He never touched the axe, but he carried the rope, lit the torches, folded the cloth over the condemned's eyes. He didn't speak, but neither did he flee. One evening, as they sat outside, watching the stars sharpen into pinpricks, Jacob asked, Do you believe we can be redeemed? Wilhelm considered the question, then said, Only if we carry what cannot be undone, and still choose not to do it again. Jacob nodded, and for the first time in years he smiled, a small, tired smile, not of joy, but of relief. He left in the spring. Didn't say where he was going, just that it was time. He left behind the cross Wilhelm had given him, but carved into its back were new initials, his child's and Wilhelm's. So now, dear listener, as your eyes flutter and your breath softens, remember this: some ghosts return not to haunt us, but to remind us we're still human, that we still feel, that we still hope, and sometimes that is enough. Tonight, as the hearth's last glow flickers and your breath settles into sleep's rhythm, I will tell you of a death that was never recorded, a life that vanished not by law, but by silence, and the man who broke the rules he swore never to bend. This is the story of the only time Wilhelm, the executioner, ended a life without an order. It was a cold evening in early spring. The snow had melted into muddy veins that ran through the cobbled streets, and the market smelled of wet hay and stale bread. Wilhelm had no summons that day, no name on his docket, no sentence to prepare. He should have been home. Instead, he walked through town at dusk, drawn by something he couldn't name. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few vendors packing up their carts. But as he passed the old tannery near, the edge of the square, he heard it. A sound too soft for a shout, too raw for a song. A whimper, low, broken. Wilhelm stopped, listened, then followed it. He found her behind a pile of discarded hides, a girl, maybe 12 years old, barely. More than a shadow. Her dress was torn, her lips split. She shook like a leaf. When he knelt beside her, she flinched. "I won't hurt you," he said. But his voice, even soft, was not built for comfort. She didn't respond. He offered his cloak. She took it. Eventually, the words came in a shivering trickle. Her name was Lena. She had no parents, no home. She had been taken in by a merchant to help with laundry, she said. But helping had turned to beating, then to worse. She had tried to run. Wilhelm led her to the church. They turned her away. Too wild, they said. Too much trouble. He took her to the magistrate's clerk. "She has no standing," the man said. "No papers, no master to speak for her." He tried the apothecary, the midwife, the widow who once left Rosemary on his doorstep. No one would keep her, so he brought her home, fed her broth, let her sleep beside the hearth. The next morning, she fed the chickens without being asked. She stayed 3 days, and on the 4th she was gone. No note, no sound. Just gone. Wilhelm searched, asked, walked the streets at night. Nothing, until a week later, when a boy from the tannery whispered that she'd been seen, dragged back to the merchant's cellar. "They said she stole something," the boy added, eyes wide. "So he's keeping her until the constables come." Wilhelm didn't go to the magistrate. He didn't go to the church. He went to the cellar. It was past midnight. No stars, no wind. Just the steady sound of his boots on wet stone. The door was unlocked. The merchant was asleep in a chair beside the hearth. Wilhelm didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed one hand on the back of the man's neck and squeezed. The man didn't fight. Long Wilhelm buried the body in the woods beyond the old oak where his shrine stones lay. He didn't mark the spot, didn't pray. Just placed a flat stone over the earth, no carvings, no initials. When he returned home, Lena was waiting. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't need to. She hugged him, once, then went to sleep. He never spoke of it to anyone, and no one asked. The merchant's absence was noticed, of course, but not mourned. His debts were many, his enemies more. Rumors spread. He had fled, or been killed by bandits, or slipped on wet stone and drowned in the river. No one looked too hard, and Wilhelm resumed his work. But something had changed for Louis. The first time in years he had chosen who lived and who died, without trial, without witness, without law, and it haunted him, not because he regretted it, but because he didn't. He began to sharpen his axe more often, not out of necessity, but ritual. He began carving smaller figures in wood, children, birds, dandelions, things that had never harmed anyone. He kept them on the mantel. Lena stayed the rest of that spring. Then one morning, she was gone again, but this time she left a note. Just one word: free. He read it until the ink smudged, and he placed it beside the axe. So now, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and your dreams prepare to open, remember this: even the just can stray. Even the hands sworn to the law can tremble. Not from guilt, but from mercy denied too long. And sometimes justice arrives not in courtrooms, but in silence, carried by the one no one dares to watch. Tonight, as the wind quiets and your eyes begin to close, let me tell you of a meeting between two men who were never meant to share a sentence, let alone a conversation. One ruled with a scepter, the other with a blade, and for one day only. They saw each other. It began with the sound of hooves. Wilhelm was splitting firewood when the first rider passed, the royal crest glinting on his breastplate. Behind him came more, banners snapping in the breeze, lances gleaming, boots pounding the thawing ground. By dusk, half the town was ablaze with preparations. The king was coming. No one remembered the last time a monarch had visited. Rumor, said he came to inspect the region's defenses. Others whispered it was to renegotiate trade tariffs with the merchant guild. A few believed he came for reasons darker, to root out sedition, perhaps, or to issue royal justice. Wilhelm didn't care. Kings came, kings went. The block remained. Still, he was summoned. A scroll arrived that evening, wax-sealed and scented with rose oil, the kind that clung to noble skin. It bore 5 words, written in a hand so elegant it barely looked human. Attend. His Majesty at dawn. No explanation. No choice. He burned the scroll after reading it. The next morning he wore black. Not out of ceremony, but because he always wore black. He washed his hands in ash water, sharpened his axe, though he suspected, and hoped, it wouldn't be needed. The royal pavilion had been erected outside the city walls near the riverbank. Velvet, gold, and silk. A world far removed from stone cells and splintered gallows. Guards flanked every corner. Banners danced above. They let Wilhelm in without a word. The tent was warm with incense, and there, sitting beneath a canopy of crimson and cream, was the king. He was not old, nor young. His face was lean, his eyes quiet, too quiet, like water that hides its depth. He did not rise when Wilhelm entered. He only gestured toward the empty chair across from him. Wilhelm remained standing. The king didn't mind. "You are the executioner," he said, as though stating the weather. Wilhelm nodded. "You've served this region for how long?" 18 years. The king sipped from a goblet of wine, then set it down. "You've taken how many lives?" Wilhelm didn't answer. "I imagine you've lost count," the king mused. "Or perhaps you carved them into your bedpost." Wilhelm said, "I carve nothing that I wish to remember." A flicker of a smile. "Do you believe in justice?" the king asked. "No." The king raised an eyebrow. "I believe in balance," Wilhelm said. "Justice is dressed in too many clothes. Balance is naked." The king leaned back. "Do you know why I asked to see you?" Wilhelm said nothing. The king poured a second glass. "There's a noble in my court," he began. "A cousin by marriage, accused of treason, spreading ideas, dangerous ones." He paused. "He will not confess." Stillness. "I may send him here," the king continued. "And I want to know, if I do, what will happen to him?" Wilhelm said, "He will die." "Even if he says nothing?" Wilhelm's voice didn't waver. "If you send him, he will already be sentenced." The king nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." He stood then, walked toward the tent flap, looked out at the river. "I envy you," he said. Wilhelm almost laughed. "Almost? You think your role is simple?" the king continued. "That you are the end, the blade. But he turned. "I am the cause. Every time I sign a decree, I wonder who will bleed for it. You only see the neck. I see the line behind it." Wilhelm met his gaze. "No," he said quietly. "I see the line too. I bury them." Silence. The king looked down at his boots. "Would you refuse the order?" "Yes." The answer came without pause. The king studied him. "And if I command you, I will still refuse." For a long time, neither man moved. Then the king said, "Good." He walked to a small chest, opened it, and removed a dagger. Gilded, ceremonial, its hilt carved with lions. He handed it to Wilhelm. "A gift," he said, "for being honest with a liar." Wilhelm took it, but did not bow. The king did not expect him to. "Will you use it?" the king asked. Wilhelm looked at the blade. "No," he said, "but I will keep it, to remind me that kings are still men." The king smiled, then nodded once. and Wilhelm left. He walked home through the market, past the gawking crowds and whispering merchants. He hung the dagger above his hearth and never touched it again. So now, dear listener, as your breathing slows and sleep begins its quiet work, remember this: even kings need someone who dares to say no. Even power must look into the eyes of consequence, and sometimes the one who holds the axe is the only man who still remembers what a life is worth tonight. As the flames of your hearth fade into a quiet, steady glow, I will tell you about a celebration, loud, colorful, full of laughter, and the man who watched it all from a distance, because he knew what had been burned beneath. This is the tale of the Festival of Ashes and of Wilhelm, who knew exactly what the ashes were made of. The festival began, as many things in old towns did, with a lie. They called it a tradition, a joyful day to mark the end of winter, the burning of bad luck, the rebirth of spring. It came with music, painted masks, wine poured into wooden cups, and flames rising from tall pyres in the square. Children danced in circles. Lovers threw herbs into the fire. The baker sold honey cakes, shaped like suns, and no one, not one person, spoke of what had once stood in that square. Because long before the festival wore silks and songs, it had worn something else: ropes, wood, soot, screams. It had been the site of the old burnings, the witch pyres, the heretic posts, the executions conducted not with an axe, but with fire in the name of purification. They'd happened so often and so publicly that the town had grown used to them. Then, over time, ashamed, so the people renamed it. They scrubbed the soot from the cobblestones, painted over the scorch marks on the church wall, and called it the Festival of Ashes. As if ashes were something that simply happened, not the result of flesh and judgment. Wilhelm knew better. He remembered every flame, every face, every woman or man tied to a post as prayers were shouted and kindling crackled beneath their feet. And now, once a year, he watched their memories erased beneath ribbons and garlands. The first year they held the festival, Wilhelm stayed home. But he could hear it: the fiddles, the clapping, the cheer. It sounded like betrayal. By the third year, he walked to the edge of the square and watched, unseen, unwelcome, and yet unable to turn away. He saw a child wearing a mask made of paper and charcoal, dancing around the central bonfire. The same fire built exactly where the last witch had burned, 15 years before. The crowd clapped. No one remembered her name, except Wilhelm. Her name had been Breda, midwife, herbalist, accused of bewitching a noble woman's child when the child died of fever. Breda hadn't screamed. She had sung a lullaby. Until the fire took her voice, Wilhelm had built that pyre. He hadn't wanted to. He had petitioned the church, pleaded with the magistrate, offered to speak on her behalf. They told him, "Your place is not to question, only to carry out." And so he had done his duty. And now they danced where she had died. The irony was not lost on him, but still, he returned each year. He watched. He listened. Once he saw a masked figure place rosemary into the fire. No one else noticed, but Wilhelm did. He followed the figure through the crowd, just far enough to see the shape of her hands. It was Magda, the widow whose husband he had promised to execute swiftly, and had done so. She remembered too. Another year, he found a wax doll tied, with twine tossed beneath a cart. It bore the stitched initials of a man he knew had died wrongly, framed by his rivals, condemned by politics. Someone had made that doll in secret. Someone had mourned him properly. Not everyone forgot, but most did. They wanted to, because forgetting was easier than admitting that fire once meant death, not warmth. That the wood they now burned had once held screams. Wilhelm never condemned the festival aloud. He never spoke against the laughter. He just watched. And each year, as the flames climbed higher, he took a small black cloth from his coat pocket, pressed it to his chest, and whispered the names, one by one. Breda, Martin the Tinker, Elski of the Forest, Joris the Stammerer, Sybil. He had 37 names. One year, a boy, no older than 10, saw him standing alone and approached. "Why? Don't you join?" the boy asked. Wilhelm didn't answer. The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed. "You look sad," he said. Wilhelm replied, "I'm remembering the people who couldn't dance." The boy blinked. Because they were old? Wilhelm shook his head. "No," he said. "Because they burned." The boy frowned, then walked away. But the next year, Wilhelm found a sprig of lavender placed gently on the firewood pile before the festival began. No one claimed it. But Wilhelm smiled. He stayed longer that year. He didn't dance. He didn't cheer. But he stood in the light of the flames, whispering names, because someone had to. So now, dear listener, as the night wraps around you and your body softens into dreams, remember this. Sometimes a celebration is not what it seems. Sometimes fire is not just warmth. And sometimes beneath the music and masks, there is silence, carrying names the world has chosen to forget. But if you remember, even just one, they are never fully gone. Tonight, as your room softens into shadow and the weight of the day begins to slip from your shoulders, let me tell you of a letter. One without seal, signature, or sender. A letter that should not have arrived, and yet did. It came to Wilhelm. On a Tuesday, folded into thirds, slipped beneath his door. There was no knock, no footsteps in the frost-covered grass, no wax, no mark, just parchment, thick, stiff, damp with morning dew, waiting for his hand. Wilhelm had received messages before, orders, summonses, requests from the court written in fine ink and arrogance. But this was different. It was written in charcoal, not ink. The letters shaky, uneven, like someone had written it in the dark, or while crying. It read, "You don't know me, but you took everything from me." His name was Thomas. He was innocent. You didn't ask, you just obeyed. There was no end, no name, no plea, just 4 lines, and a ghost. Wilhelm sat with it for hours. He didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't sharpen the axe. He read it again and again, until the parchment tore slightly at the folds. He remembered Thomas. Of course he did. A scribe, 25. Accused of forging documents that had cost a noble family a fortune. He'd claimed innocence, sworn he'd been framed, named a merchant, a magistrate, even a priest. The court called it madness. The confession was extracted under pressure. Wilhelm had known. He had seen the bruises, the broken finger, the tremble in the boy's voice. But the scroll came anyway, signed, sealed, undeniable. He had done his duty. The axe had been sharp. One stroke, but it had not been clean, because something in Thomas's eyes, something that did not flinch, had followed Wilhelm home that day. And now, years later, someone remembered. Someone who had loved him, and someone who had waited in silence until the hurt turned into handwriting. Wilhelm folded the letter carefully. He did not burn it. He placed it on the mantel, beside the wooden cross and the dagger the king had once given him. And then, for the first time in a long while, he sat down and wrote back. He had no name, no address, only the firelight and the ache in his chest. He wrote, "I remember, Thomas, and I remember the silence that followed. If I could go back, I would speak. Not to the court, to him, and I would say, I see you, and I'm sorry. He left the note on the edge of the woods, where the shrine stones stood, pinned beneath a piece of flint. He knew it would be gone by morning. He didn't need to see who took it. The point wasn't to be forgiven, it was to answer. Because ghosts don't fade from time. They fade from being unacknowledged. That night, Wilhelm did not sleep. But he did not dream either. He simply stared at the rafters, the glow of the coals, the letter on the mantel. He wondered how many others there were. How many letters had never been written? How many names would never be spoken again? He took up a piece of parchment the next day, and he wrote every name he could remember, not just the guilty, not just the innocent, all of them. He didn't categorize. He didn't justify. He just wrote. By sunset, the parchment was full. He folded it, slipped it into the wooden box beneath his bed, the one that held old buttons, broken string, and a child's scarf once left behind by a girl named Lena. The box didn't look like much, but it carried the weight of everything the courts had tried to forget. Wilhelm never received another letter, but he checked the woods each morning, and every now and then there would be a stone placed on the shrine, unmarked, but present. So now, dear listener, as your breath falls steady and the quiet surrounds you, remember this. Some things are never truly gone. Not when they're written, not when they're remembered, and not when a man with rough hands finally dares to say, I was wrong. Tonight, as the world softens and your breath eases into stillness, I want to tell you of a small pair of eyes that saw more than they should have, eyes that did not flinch, even when the rope pulled tight. This is the story of a child, of a gallows, and of a moment that Wilhelm, the executioner, would never forget. It was a hanging. Like many others before it, a thief named Marek, caught after his fifth crime, this time with a blade in hand and blood on his shirt. The court was swift. The rope was tied, the post oiled. The townspeople gathered like they always did. Wilhelm had performed more than 100 hangings by then. He had measured the drop, calculated the weight, checked the knot. All familiar, all precise. But that day, someone stood out from the crowd. She was small, no more than 7, maybe 8. A child in a blue wool cloak, hand-sewn, fraying at the edges. Her hood was pulled low, but Wilhelm saw her face clearly as he mounted the scaffold. She stood between 2 older boys who shoved and whispered, eager to see the snap. But she did not laugh, did not cover her eyes. She stood straight still, her gaze locked on the noose like it was a snake curled in the sky. Wilhelm hesitated. He rarely looked at the crowd. It was easier that way. But something in her stillness, the sheer gravity of her attention, unsettled him. He did his work. He spoke the sentence. He read the charge. Marek stood silent. The rope was lowered. Wilhelm tightened the knot behind the ear. Quick, clean, silent. The trapdoor opened. Marek dropped. His neck cracked. The body swung. The crowd clapped once, then dispersed, drifting like leaves in wind. But the girl stayed. Long after the body had been cut down, long after the priest had closed his book, she stood there, staring not at the noose, but at Wilhelm. When he stepped down, he passed her. She did not flinch. Instead, she asked a question, soft, steady. Did it hurt? Wilhelm stopped. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, No, not this time. She nodded, then asked, Do you always know? No, he admitted, but I try. She studied him for a long moment, then said, You look sad. I am, he replied. Because he died? Because I don't know if it was enough. Enough for what? To make the world better. She nodded again, as if that answer made more sense than anything the adults had said that morning. Then she held out a piece of bread, stale, cracked. "I don't have coins," she said, "but I want to give something." Wilhelm didn't move, so she placed it on the edge of the platform and walked away. The next morning, the bread was gone, taken by crows, most likely. But he remembered the shape of it, and the small hand that had offered it without fear. Days passed, then weeks. He did not see her again, but something lingered. Not guilt, not sorrow, accountability, because she had looked at him not with hatred nor reverence, but with expectation, as if waiting for him to prove he deserved the burden he carried. It changed the way he walked to the scaffold. He began reading the names aloud, not just the crimes, but the names, as if speaking them, gave them dignity, even in death. He started checking the rope not once, but twice. He requested a cloth for the condemned, to cover their faces if they chose, and once, when a man panicked before the drop, he stepped forward and took his hand. Not for drama, but because he remembered a girl asking, "Did it hurt?" And he wanted to be able to answer, "No," with more certainty next time. Months later, a basket appeared on his doorstep. Inside, a round of cheese, a sprig of mint, and a note, written in a child's hand. "You looked less sad this time." He smiled, and for the first time in a long while, it reached his eyes. So now, dear listener, as your breath slows and sleep draws near, remember this. Sometimes the smallest witnesses carry the clearest sight. Sometimes the truth is not spoken by judges or kings, but whispered by children at the edge of justice. And sometimes a single honest question is enough to change the hands that hold the rope. Tonight, as the world slows to a hush and your room gathers its shadows close, I will tell you a story about absence, not of people, but of certainty, and how the vanishing of a single object, simple and old, shook an entire town more than any execution ever could. This is the story of the day Wilhelm's axe was stolen. It was a cold morning. Clouds hung low over the rooftops like wool soaked in ash. The square was quiet. No executions scheduled, no sermons, just the stillness of a town pretending nothing lurked beneath its silence. Wilhelm woke early, as he always did. He fed the chickens, boiled water for tea, sharpened his axe, or tried to, because when he lifted the lid of the chest beneath his hearth, the axe was gone. No broken lock, no footprints in the soot, no sign of force, just absence. He stared at the empty chest for a long time, longer than necessary, as if the blade might reappear by will alone. It didn't. By midday, the rumor had already spread. They say the executioner's axe is gone. Gone? Stolen. Some laughed. Others whispered. A few crossed themselves, because even if they feared the man who held the blade, they needed the blade to exist. Its presence, dull and terrible, meant someone else would always be held accountable. Someone else would bleed. Someone else would end. But without the axe, what now? The magistrate summoned Wilhelm by the fourth bell. He stood behind his desk, pale and sweating. "You must recover it," he barked. "Immediately." Wilhelm only nodded. "I can delay the hanging 2 days," the magistrate continued. "But no more. The crowd expects it. The Merchants' Guild already paid for guards. There's coin involved." Wilhelm didn't reply. He was already walking out the door. He didn't search the alleys, didn't interrogate the tavern folk or peer into wells. He went straight to the woods, to the old oak behind his cottage, to the shrine, and there it was. His axe, not hidden, not buried, placed with care. Propped upright against the stone marker of Breda, the woman who had burned for being too wise in herbs and too kind with her hands. A scrap of cloth fluttered from the handle. Wilhelm took it. It read, "You." Forgot who it belonged to? Just that. Nothing more. The handwriting, small, cramped, female. He knew immediately. It had been Magda, the widow, the one who had once begged mercy for her husband, the one who had left Rosemary on his step. She had taken the axe and returned it, but not without message. That night, Wilhelm did not lock the chest. He left the axe leaning beside the door. He wanted to remember what its absence had taught him, because the truth was, for one whole day, he had felt something he hadn't in years. Fear. Not for himself, but for what the town would become without the ritual of death, without the weight of the axe to keep the law tethered to something more than parchment. That day, the butcher charged more for meat. The constable struck a boy in the square. The magistrate doubled the fine for late taxes. The fear had already begun to spread, because when the blade disappears, people start to wonder who will swing next, and with what. Wilhelm cleaned the axe slowly, not as punishment, as reflection. He carved a small new figure that night, not of a saint or a condemned man, but of a woman in a hood, holding a blade, across her lap like a sleeping child. He placed it on the mantel, not as a warning, as respect. So now, dear listener, as your breath slows and your mind softens, remember this. Power isn't only in the blade. It's in who remembers it, who fears it, and who chooses even for a moment to take it, not to kill, but to remind the world that death, like silence, can be stolen. Tonight, as you drift toward the quiet space between waking and sleep, I will tell you about a dream, not born of fantasy, but of memory. A dream so quiet it had no voices, so heavy it left footprints on a soul. This is the dream Wilhelm never spoke of, the one he feared more than judgment, because it was not filled with screams, but with silence. It came in winter. The wind had pressed against the windows for days, howling like a wolf denied. The fire cracked low. Wilhelm had finished his broth, cleaned the blade, and fallen into sleep without prayer. And in that sleep, he stood in the town square, but it was empty. No scaffold, no people, no ropes, no magistrate reading charges, just cobblestones beneath a gray sky, and a single chair in the center, wooden, unremarkable. He walked toward it, each step echoed. There were no birds, no bells, just the sound of breath, not his but others, soft, surrounding. He turned. They were behind him, all of them, the ones he had executed, not in flesh, but in outline. Shadows filled with presence, men, women, the old, the very young. Some stood with hands folded, others with arms crossed. None spoke, but all stared. He did not flinch. He knew who they were. He began naming them, one by one. Brida, Tomas, Joris, Elske, Lena's brother, the merchant's son who had cried, the thief who had laughed, the noble who had prayed too late. He named until his voice cracked, but the shadows did not fade. They only moved, closer, and then they opened their mouths, but no sound came out, just silence, and that was worse than any scream, because silence in that place meant something unspoken, not blame, not forgiveness, just wait, as if they were asking, "Do you remember who we were before we died?" Wilhelm tried to speak, to answer, but his mouth had vanished. He raised his hands, but they held no axe. He reached for his belt, no dagger. He was just a man in black, unarmed. Then the chair creaked. He turned. A child now sat there, barefoot, head bowed, holding a sprig of rosemary. She looked up, and it was the girl at the gallows. She whispered one word, "Why?" but not with anger, not with accusation, just sorrow. Wilhelm opened his mouth, still gone. He fell to his knees. The shadows closed in, not to harm, but to witness, to wait, to see if he would finally cry. He didn't. Not yet. But when he woke, his cheeks were wet, not from sweat, from tears. The room was cold, the fire low. The axe leaned quietly by the door, and outside, the snow fell. He didn't tell anyone about the dream, not the priest, not the widow, not Jakob, if he had returned. Instead, he wrote it down, every detail, folded the parchment, placed it in the wooden box beneath his bed, beside the scarf, the coin, the letter with no name. He carved a small figure the next day. It was him, kneeling, palms empty, eyes closed. He placed it on the mantel, facing the window. That night, he whispered a name before sleep. Not a condemned, but his own. So now, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and your breath slows, remember this. The dead do not always haunt us with rage. Sometimes they visit in silence, to ask if we still know their names, to ask if we still feel. And sometimes in dreams, we finally answer. Tonight, as the air lies still and the edges of sleep begin to blur the day's weight, I want to tell you of the last time Wilhelm climbed the scaffold, of the final breath he measured, of the execution that never truly happened, not because it wasn't scheduled, but because something deeper, older, and quieter stepped in. This is the story of the day the blade refused to fall. The man's name was Ansel, a carpenter, gray-haired, quiet, not a rebel, not a killer, just a man. He was accused of treason, of saying the wrong thing in the wrong tavern, words that might have passed unnoticed on another night in another season. But the region was restless, taxes high, trust low, and so the court needed a message. And the message would be Ansel. Wilhelm knew from the beginning that something was different. Ansel had no fear, not bravado, not defiance, just acceptance. The kind Wilhelm had seen only once before, in a woman burned for her books, who had whispered, "I forgive you," as the torch was lowered. Ansel said nothing like that. He simply met Wilhelm's eyes the morning of the execution, and nodded once, as though to say, "I know what this is, and I know what you are." The scaffold creaked beneath their boots. The rope was ready. The crowd gathered slowly, uneasy. There was no joy in their murmurs, no bloodlust, only something quieter, uncomfortable, like a town trying to believe a lie too large to swallow. The magistrate read the sentence with less ceremony than usual. The priest muttered his blessing and stepped back. Wilhelm adjusted the knot behind the man's ear. Ansel turned his head slightly and said, almost conversationally, "It's all right." And Wilhelm, steady, silent, practiced Wilhelm, hesitated, just for a second. His hand gripped the lever. His breath slowed. The crowd leaned in, but the blade did not fall, because Wilhelm's hand would not move. It wasn't locked. It wasn't paralyzed. It simply chose not to obey for the first time in 2 decades. The silence stretched. A murmur rolled through the square like distant thunder. The magistrate stepped forward, confused. "Is there a delay?" he asked. Wilhelm didn't answer. He stepped down from the platform, walked to the foot of the scaffold, and placed the axe carefully on the ground, then turned to the crowd and spoke. "I will not kill this man." The words fell like stones into a pond. No one moved. Not Ansel, not the priest, not the birds overhead. The magistrate sputtered, "You are under oath. This is disobedience." Wilhelm said, "Then strike me down yourself." He did not shout. He did not plead. He simply waited. And the magistrate did nothing. Because he had never held the axe. He had never faced the rope. He only signed papers and sipped wine. And now, when the blade was still, he found he had no hands for justice. Ansel stepped down. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just walked, through the stunned crowd, through the silent street, into the world again. No one stopped him. No one dared. That night, Wilhelm sat beside the fire, staring at his empty hands. He had defied the court, broken his oath, shattered the ritual. He waited for the guards, for the summons, for exile. None came, because power, once embarrassed, often prefers to pretend nothing happened. The next day, the scaffold was quietly dismantled. The magistrate said nothing. The priest delivered a sermon about mercy as strength. And the town, stunned, relieved, unsure, simply returned to its routines. Wilhelm never executed again. No one asked him to. The axe remained beside the hearth, unmoved, untouched. One morning, he carved a final figure. Ansel, seated, calm, hands resting in his lap. He placed it on the mantel, facing outward. So now, dear listener, as your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts drift far, remember this. Even the sharpest blade can be stilled. Even the man who delivers death can choose silence. And sometimes justice is not what the hand does, but what it refuses to do. Tonight, as the fire fades low and your thoughts settle gently into the stillness of sleep, I will tell you about an ending. A final resting place not marked by glory nor scorn, but by the sound of leaves brushing against stone, and the footsteps of those who remember without words. This is the story of where Wilhelm was buried. There was no public notice, no bell tolled from the chapel, no court official stood to announce the loss. It happened quietly, the way most things around. Wilhelm had always happened, without ceremony, without claim. One morning, the butcher's boy noticed smoke no longer curled from Wilhelm's chimney. The chickens, always fed before dawn, clucked anxiously at the gate. The front door was closed, but not latched. Inside, the hearth was cold, the kettle untouched. They found him in his chair, back straight, hands folded, a small wooden figure resting in his palm. The girl in the blue cloak, carved long ago, her eyes turned upward, as though still asking, "Did it hurt?" He had died in his sleep, peacefully, alone, just as he had lived. The magistrate, informed by the baker's wife, offered a brief shrug. "A man like him," he said, "deserves something." But no one volunteered a funeral. No one offered land. No one knew what was appropriate for the man who had once swung the axe and once refused to. The church would not allow him to be buried in consecrated ground. "His soul is between him and God," the priest said, "but the soil is ours," the townspeople mumbled, then moved on. But Jacob returned, the apprentice, older now, face-lined, hands thick with work. He came the day after the silence began, riding a weathered mule, cloak damp with rain. He entered the cottage, sat for hours, did not touch the body, did not speak. Then, as dusk fell, he lifted Wilhelm gently into a cloth shroud, stitched it closed, and carried him, step by step, into the woods. No one followed. He walked beyond the shrine, past the oak, to a small clearing where wildflowers grew stubbornly even in frost. And there, with bare hands, Jakob dug. It took most of the night. When the grave was ready, he placed the shroud into it and covered it slowly, carefully, stone by stone. He did not mark it with a cross or a name. Instead, he took the axe, Wilhelm's axe, and drove it deep into the soil at the head of the grave, blade first. Then, beside it, he placed the last figure Wilhelm had carved, Ansel, the man who had lived because the axe had not fallen. And then he sat until the sun rose. In the weeks that followed, others came, not in crowds, alone, quietly. The widow who had once left Rosemary, the girl in the blue cloak, now older, carrying bread she left on the stones. Even the magistrate, wrapped in gilt and fur, came one foggy morning and stared at the axe until his knees gave way. No one ever spoke, but the grave was never untended. Someone always brought wood for the fire pit Jacob built nearby. Someone always replaced the flowers when they wilted, and someone, no one knew who, carved into the hilt of the axe, one letter at a time. He remembered every name. Years passed. The town grew. The scaffold was never rebuilt. The square was used for markets, for dancing, for light. But on cold nights, when the wind shifted just so, the townspeople said they could hear it. The creak of old wood, the hush of a blade choosing not to fall, and the soft breath of a man who had learned too late that justice was not in the swing, but in the silence before it. So now, dear listener, as your thoughts float gently into sleep and your world grows hushed, remember this. There was once a man who carried every death, until the day he chose not to, and though his name was never written, in stone his memory remains carved into the stillness.